The needle trembled in his calloused fingers like a dying bird. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his shirt, painting dark maps across weathered cotton, while the desert wind whispered secrets through the cabin's broken shutters. She had appeared from nowhere, this woman with steady hands and eyes that held no questions, only quiet determination. When she pointed at the wound, then the needle, something inside him cracked open like drought-parched earth receiving its first rain. The cowboy watched her stitch, and in that watching discovered he had been holding his breath for longer than he could remember. Subscribe now to follow this journey of unexpected healing in the unforgiving West. The cabin stood like a forgotten prayer against the endless sky, its weathered boards holding secrets that only the wind dared whisper. Inside, lamplight flickered across walls that had witnessed more confessions than any church, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the moment. The cowboy sat rigid on a wooden chair, his spine straight as a rifle barrel, while crimson drops fell steady as a broken clock onto the dusty floor below. His shirt hung open, revealing a gash that ran diagonal across his ribs like a signature written in pain. The wound spoke of violence, recent and personal, a knife fight behind Murphy's saloon where honor had cost him more than pride. He had stumbled here seeking solitude to tend his injury, never expecting to find her waiting in the amber glow, as if she had been summoned by his very need. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned that sudden movements could shatter more than silence. Her dress was simple calico, faded from too many washings and too much sun, but her hands, those hands held the steadiness of someone who had sewn life back together more times than she cared to count. When she reached for the needle he held, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and he felt something electric pass between them, something that had nothing to do with the storm gathering outside. Her touch was neither gentle nor rough, but certain, the touch of someone who understood that healing required both tenderness and strength. She did not ask his name, did not inquire about the fight that had marked him, did not offer empty words of comfort that would only cheapen the gravity of the moment. Instead, she simply pointed, first at the wound that wept red tears down his side, then at the needle that trembled in his grip like a compass seeking true north. The taking of the needle from his hand was not theft, but rescue. He watched as she held it up to the lamplight, examining the silver point with the concentration of a jeweler appraising a diamond, her eyes narrowing as she threaded it with practiced efficiency. The thread was black as midnight, strong as the promises men made in their final moments, and as she pulled it taut, he found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, a mouth that had kissed both hello and goodbye too many times, and a jaw set with the determination of someone who had learned that survival meant doing what needed to be done, regardless of comfort or convention. She was neither young nor old, but existed in that timeless space where experience had carved beauty into something deeper than mere appearance. Her hair, brown as rich earth after rain, was pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the graceful curve of her neck, and he found himself wondering what tragedy had brought her to this forgotten place. What story lived behind those steady, knowing eyes? When she leaned closer to begin her work, he caught the scent of lavender and wood smoke that clung to her skin like a benediction. The first touch of the needle was a sharp kiss of silver fire, but he did not flinch, would not allow himself that weakness in her presence. Instead, he watched her face as she worked, noting the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips pressed together in a thin line of determination, the way her breathing remained steady and controlled, even as his own grew shallow with pain. Each stitch was placed with surgical precision, pulling the torn edges of his flesh together like the binding of a book whose pages had been scattered by wind. The thread drew tight, creating a ladder of black crosses that climbed his ribs like a rosary of healing. And with each pull, he felt not just his skin mending, but something deeper, some fundamental tear in the fabric of his solitude beginning to close. She worked in complete silence, the only sounds the whisper of thread through flesh, the distant rumble of thunder, and the steady rhythm of their synchronized breathing. The pain was exquisite in its clarity, cutting through the fog of whiskey and regret that had clouded his thoughts for weeks. With each precise movement of her hands, he felt more present, more alive than he had since the day he had ridden into this God-forsaken territory with nothing but a horse, a gun, and a heart full of bitter memories. She was stitching more than flesh. She was weaving him back into the world of the living, one careful thread at a time. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual before, who understood that healing was both art and necessity, requiring equal parts skill and faith. The lamplight caught the silver of the needle as it danced in and out of his skin, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to slow time itself until the entire world narrowed to this moment, this room. This woman whose name he did not know, but whose touch was rewriting the very definition of trust in his wounded heart. As she worked, he found himself memorizing every detail. The way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the small scar on her left hand that spoke of her own encounters with sharp edges, the unconscious way she hummed under her breath, a melody so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind. The final stitch was placed with the solemnity of a prayer's amen, and as she tied off the thread and cut it clean with a small pair of scissors that appeared from somewhere in the folds of her dress, he felt the weight of completion settle over them both, like a shared secret. She stepped back to examine her work, her head tilted slightly to one side, and he saw in her eyes not pride, but simple satisfaction, the quiet contentment of a job done well, a wound properly tended, a small victory claimed against the chaos that seemed to govern this harsh land. The stitches lay neat and even across his ribs, a testament to her skill and his endurance, and as he looked down at the careful repair of his damaged flesh, he realized that something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not be undone by morning light or the return of common sense. The needle lay abandoned on the wooden table like a discarded weapon after battle, its silver surface still warm from the heat of her hands and stained with the evidence of their shared ordeal. She moved away from him with the same quiet grace that had marked her approach, but now there was something different in her bearing, a subtle relaxation of shoulders that had been held too rigid, a softening around the eyes that suggested the completion of some sacred duty. The cowboy remained motionless in his chair, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the spell that had been woven between them, might break the delicate thread of connection that felt more precious than the black silk that now held his flesh together. Outside, the storm that had been threatening finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows with a violence that made the cabin feel like a ship riding out a tempest. And in that enclosed space, they existed in a bubble of lamplight and shared silence that felt separate from the rest of the world. The wound throbbed with a clean pain now, the kind of hurt that spoke of healing rather than damage, and he found himself grateful not just for her skill, but for the strange mercy that had brought her to this place at the exact moment when he needed her most. She busied herself with cleaning the needle and returning it to a small leather pouch that she drew from her apron pocket, her movements economical and practiced, as if this ritual of healing was as familiar to her as breathing. He watched her hands as they worked, noting the way her fingers moved with unconscious precision, the way she handled each tool with the reverence of someone who understood that in this harsh land, the ability to mend what was broken could mean the difference between life and death. There was something almost ceremonial in the way she folded the blood-stained cloth and set it aside, in the way she corked the small bottle of whiskey that had served as antiseptic, in the way she smoothed her skirts and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. These small gestures spoke of a woman who had learned to find order in chaos, who had made peace with the necessity of tending wounds in a world that seemed determined to create them. When she finally looked at him again, her eyes held a question that she did not voice, and he found himself nodding in response to words that had never been spoken, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity that needed no translation. The silence that stretched between them was not empty but full, pregnant with all the things they might say if they were different people in a different place, heavy with the weight of recognition that sometimes strangers could see into the deepest parts of each other's souls with a clarity that eluded those who claimed to know them best. He wanted to thank her, to offer payment, to ask her name and her story and what had brought her to this forgotten corner of the territory. But somehow he understood that words would only diminish what had passed between them. Instead, he simply sat and watched as she moved about the small cabin, straightening things that did not need straightening, her presence transforming the rough space into something that felt almost like home. The rain continued its assault on the roof and walls, creating a percussion that seemed to echo the rhythm of his heartbeat, and in that steady drumming, he heard something like music, something like hope, something like the promise that even in the darkest places, unexpected grace could still find a way to break through. She paused at the window, her silhouette framed against the storm-dark glass, and for a moment she seemed less like a flesh-and-blood woman than like some spirit of mercy that had taken human form to tend to the wounded and the lost. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat, the gentle slope of her shoulders, and he found himself thinking that he had never seen anything more beautiful than this quiet woman who had appeared from nowhere to stitch his broken flesh back. Together with hands that held no judgment, only compassion, when she turned back to face him, there was something in her expression that he could not quite read, a mixture of sadness and satisfaction, of completion and reluctance, as if she too understood that this moment existed outside of normal time, and that its ending would return them both to the harsh realities of their separate lives. The storm showed no signs of abating, and he found himself hoping that it would continue through the night, that the rain would keep falling and the wind would keep howling, creating a barrier between this sacred space and the world beyond that demanded explanations and adherence to social conventions that felt suddenly meaningless. The fire in the small stone hearth had burned low while she worked, and now she moved to tend it, adding wood with the same careful attention she had given to his wound, building the flames back to a steady glow that pushed the shadows into the corners and filled the room with warmth that seemed to seep into his bones. As she knelt before the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing light, he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name, a loneliness that matched his own, a weariness that spoke of too many nights spent in empty rooms, too many dawns that brought nothing but the promise of another day of solitude. She was beautiful in the way that broken things could be beautiful, marked by experience but not defeated by it, scarred but not bitter. And as he watched her tend the fire with the same gentle competence she had shown in tending his wound, he felt something shift inside him, some long-frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw in the warmth of her presence. The realization came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert, that he did not want this night to end, did not want her to disappear back into whatever life had brought her here, did not want to return to the empty existence that had been his companion for so long. When she rose from the hearth and turned to face him again, the firelight dancing across her features like a blessing, he saw his own longing reflected in her eyes, and understood that she too felt the pull of this unexpected connection, this moment of grace that had bloomed between them like a flower in the desert. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended, held in the amber glow of lamplight and firelight, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the silence that spoke louder than any words they might have shared. She moved toward him again, not to tend his wound this time, but simply to be near, and as she settled into the chair across from him, he felt the last of his defenses crumble like walls built of sand. leaving him exposed and vulnerable and strangely grateful for the chance to be truly seen by someone who understood that healing required more than just needle and thread. It required the courage to trust, to hope, to believe that even the most damaged souls could be made whole again. The morning came with a stillness that felt heavier than the desert heat. Sarah moved through the cabin like a ghost, haunting her own life, her fingers still trembling from the memory of his blood beneath her touch. She had sewn wounds before, torn fabric, split seams, the practical mending that kept a woman's world together, but never had she felt the pulse of another's life beating so close to her own heartbeat. The cowboy sat at her kitchen table, his shirt draped over the chair back like a flag of surrender, and she found herself stealing glances at the careful line of stitches that marked where his pain had become her purpose. The coffee grew cold between them, but neither seemed willing to break the fragile peace that had settled over the room like morning mist. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had forgotten how to ask for anything, and she realized that somewhere in the darkness of the previous night they had crossed a line that neither of them fully understood. The silence stretched between them, not empty but full of all the words they couldn't yet say, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. A door opening that she had thought was permanently sealed. His eyes followed her movements as she tidied the small space, and she could feel the weight of his attention like sunlight on her skin. There was something different about the way he watched her now, not with the casual assessment of a stranger seeking shelter, but with the careful attention of a man trying to memorize something precious. She had grown accustomed to being invisible, to moving through her days like a shadow cast by someone who had long since walked away, but under his gaze she felt substantial again, real in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. The simple act of pouring water into a basin became something sacred, each gesture deliberate and meaningful, as if she were performing a ritual that would bind them together in ways that words never could. When their fingers brushed as she handed him a clean cloth, the contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too. This unexpected current that seemed to flow between them like water finding its way through parched earth. The morning light streaming through her window caught the silver in his hair, and she thought about how beautiful broken things could be when someone took the time to really see them. The wound pulled tight when he moved, and she watched him wince with a sympathy that surprised her in its intensity. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, constructing barriers that would keep the world at a safe distance. But this stranger had somehow slipped past her defenses without even trying. Perhaps it was the way he had trusted her with his pain, or the quiet dignity with which he bore his suffering, but something about him called to the part of her that still believed in healing, in second chances, in the possibility that two damaged souls might find solace in each other's company. She found herself wanting to know his story, to understand what had brought him to her door bleeding and desperate. But she also understood that some wounds ran deeper than flesh, and that healing required patience as much as skill. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but companionable, like two people who had found an unexpected refuge in each other's presence, and were reluctant to disturb the peace they had discovered. When he stood to leave, she felt panic flutter in her chest like a bird trapped in a cage. The thought of returning to her solitary existence, of watching the empty horizon swallow him up like it had swallowed so many others, filled her with a loneliness so acute it took her breath away. She had grown accustomed to her isolation, had even convinced herself that she preferred it. But now the prospect of silence without his presence seemed unbearable. He moved slowly, favoring his injured side, and she could see the effort it cost him to maintain his composure, to present the facade of strength that men like him wore like armor against the world. But she had seen beneath that armor now, had felt the vulnerability that lay hidden beneath his weathered exterior, and she knew that he was as reluctant to leave as she was to let him go. The morning stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, and she found herself searching for reasons to delay his departure, small tasks that might keep him in her orbit just a little longer. The sound of horses approaching broke the spell that had settled over them, and Sarah felt her heart sink as reality intruded on their fragile sanctuary. Through the window, she could see riders on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky, and she knew instinctively that they were looking for him. The cowboy's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his body tensing like a coiled spring, and she saw the hunted look return to his eyes, the same desperate wariness that had brought him to her door in the darkness. Without thinking, she moved to stand between him and the window, as if her small frame could somehow shield him from whatever danger approached. And in that moment, she realized that she would do anything to protect this man who had stumbled into her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. The riders were still distant, but getting closer, and she could feel time slipping away like sand through her fingers, carrying with it the possibility of something she had thought was lost to her forever. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them, and she wondered if this was how all beautiful things ended, not with violence or drama, but with the simple, inexorable passage of time that swept away everything tender and new before it had a chance to take root and grow. The riders moved like dark prophecy across the desert floor, their horses kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah pressed herself against the window frame, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the silhouettes. 5 men, maybe 6, their purpose written in the deliberate way they spread across the landscape like fingers of a grasping hand. Behind her, she could hear the cowboy moving with careful urgency, gathering his few possessions with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to travel light and leave quickly. The morning that had felt so full of possibility now seemed fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the first harsh word or sudden movement. She wanted to ask him who they were, what they wanted, why he had to run, but the questions died in her throat as she saw the resignation settle over his features like a familiar coat. This was his life, this constant flight, this endless looking over his shoulder, and she was just a brief respite in a journey that had no destination, only the perpetual motion of a man trying to stay one step ahead of his past. He paused at her kitchen table, his hand resting on the back of the chair where he had sat through the long night, and she saw something flicker across his face. Regret, perhaps, or longing for a different kind of life. The stitches in his side pulled tight as he reached for his shirt, and she moved without thinking, her hands covering his to still the motion. For a moment they stood frozen like that, her fingers warm against his weathered skin, and she felt the tremor that ran through him at her touch. The riders were closer now, close enough that she could make out the hard lines of their faces, the way they sat their horses with the confidence of men who were accustomed to taking what they wanted. But in this suspended moment, with her hands on his and the morning light painting everything golden, the outside world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the connection that had sparked between them in the darkness. She wanted to tell him to stay, to fight, to choose her over whatever ghosts were chasing him across the desert, but she could see in his eyes that he had already made his choice, and it was breaking both their hearts. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather, and Sarah felt the last of her courage desert her like water poured into sand. She had lived her whole life as a spectator, watching other people make the bold choices while she remained safely on the sidelines, and now, when it mattered most, she found herself paralyzed by the same fear that had kept her trapped in this lonely place for so many years. The cowboy's eyes searched her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail, and she realized that he was saying goodbye without words, preparing to walk out of her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The unfairness of it all, to find something precious only to have it snatched away before she could even name it, filled her with a rage so pure and clean it surprised her. She had accepted so much loss in her life, had learned to swallow disappointment like bitter medicine, but this felt different, like losing something she hadn't even known she needed until it was already slipping through her fingers. Outside, the riders had slowed their approach, spreading out in a loose semicircle that would make escape difficult if not impossible. Sarah could see their leader now, a tall man with silver hair and eyes like winter ice, and something about the way he sat, his horse, spoke of authority and ruthless determination. These were not ordinary drifters or cattle rustlers. They moved with the precision of men who had a specific purpose and the resources to see it through. The cowboy must have recognized something in their formation because his entire body went rigid, and she saw his hand drift instinctively toward the gun belt he had laid aside the night before. But the weapon was across the room, and the riders were already close enough to see movement through the windows, and she realized with a sick certainty that running was no longer an option. The trap was closing around them with the inexorable precision of a clockwork mechanism, and all her desperate wishes couldn't change the mathematics of pursuit and capture that had been set in motion long before she had ever laid eyes on this wounded stranger. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring as the riders drew rein just outside her fence line, their horses stamping and blowing in the morning heat. Sarah could feel the cowboy's tension radiating from him, like heat from a forge, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything, for him, for her, for the fragile connection they had discovered in the darkness. The leader of the group dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like a judge's gavel, and she saw the cowboy's shoulders slump in defeat. There would be no dramatic escape, no last-minute rescue, no fairy tale ending to this brief interlude of tenderness and hope. Reality had arrived in the form of hard men with harder purposes, and the dream that had sustained her through the long night was about to be shattered like morning frost beneath the desert sun. But as the cowboy turned to face whatever judgment awaited him, Sarah felt something crystallize inside her chest, a determination born not of courage, but of love, the kind of fierce protectiveness that could transform even the meekest soul into something formidable. She might not be able to save him, but she would not let him face this alone, and in that moment of decision she discovered that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The knock on her door came with the authority of men who were accustomed to having their summons answered quickly. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the latch, but her voice was steady when she called out that she was coming, and she felt a strange pride in that small victory over her fear. The cowboy had positioned himself behind the door, his back pressed against the wall, like a man preparing for his own execution, and she could see the resignation in his eyes, the look of someone who had always known this moment would come and had made his peace with it long ago. But she had not made her peace with it, and as she lifted the latch, she felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her like a flame that had been banked but never truly extinguished. These men might have the right to take him, might have the law or justice or vengeance on their side, but they would have to go through her first, and she discovered that the prospect of standing between him and harm felt less like sacrifice than like coming home to herself. The leader stood on her threshold with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his pale eyes swept over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl. But she held her ground and met his gaze without flinching. Behind him, his men sat their horses like statues carved from stone and shadow, their faces hard and patient beneath the brims of their hats. When he spoke, his voice was cultured and soft, the kind of tone that made his words sound reasonable even when they carried the weight of threat. He was looking for a man, he said, a man who had taken something that didn't belong to him, and he had reason to believe that man might have sought shelter here. The politeness of his inquiry didn't fool her for a moment. She could see the steel beneath the silk, the violence that lurked behind his civilized facade. But she had found her own steel in the crucible of the night, and when she told him that she lived alone and had seen no strangers, her voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. The cowboy's breathing was so quiet she could barely hear it, but she could feel his presence behind the door like a second heartbeat in her chest. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly, and she knew he didn't believe her. But something in her manner, perhaps the way she stood in her doorway like a guardian protecting sacred ground, gave him pause. He asked if he might search her property, and the request was phrased as a courtesy, but they both knew it was really a demand, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of politeness. Sarah felt time slow to a crawl as she considered her options, knowing that whatever she said next would determine not just the cowboy's fate, but her own. She could step aside, let them search, claim ignorance when they found him, and perhaps escape with nothing more than a stern warning about harboring fugitives. Or she could stand her ground, force them to show their true colors, and accept whatever consequences came from choosing love over safety. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing, and she heard herself telling the silver-haired man that he was welcome to look around, but he would do so over her dead body. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down in the dust of a street at high noon. Sarah saw something flicker in the leader's pale eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect for her unexpected defiance. And she realized that he had not expected resistance from a lone woman in a cabin at the edge of nowhere. Behind him, his men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons with the unconscious ease of predators scenting blood, but their leader held up a hand to still them. He studied her face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle, and she could see him weighing the cost of forcing his way past her against the potential complications of harming a woman who had done nothing more than refuse to cooperate. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his decision. She had thrown the dice, made her choice, and now she could only stand there and face whatever consequences her defiance had earned. When the leader finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration mixed with regret. He told her that she was either very brave or very foolish, and that in his experience the two were often indistinguishable. He had no quarrel with her, he said, and no desire to harm an innocent woman, but the man he sought had committed crimes that demanded justice, and he would not be deterred by misplaced loyalty or romantic notions. The words stung because they carried just enough truth to wound. She barely knew this man, had no real reason to trust him, no logical basis for the fierce protectiveness that had seized her heart. But logic had nothing to do with the way she felt when she looked at him, nothing to do with the certainty that had settled in her bones like truth, carved in stone. She had spent her whole life being reasonable, being careful, being safe, and where had it gotten her? Alone in a cabin at the edge of the world, watching life pass by like a distant storm. If this was foolishness, then she would embrace it with both hands and no regrets. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, two wills locked in silent combat, but the decision was taken from both of them when the cowboy stepped into view. He moved slowly, his hands visible and empty, and Sarah felt her heart break a little at the quiet dignity with which he surrendered himself to his fate. He spoke her name softly, a single word that carried all the gratitude and regret that couldn't be expressed in the time they had left. And she saw in his eyes that he understood what her defiance had cost her, what it meant that she had been willing to stand between him and harm. The leader's men tensed as he appeared, but he made no move toward his weapon, offered no resistance as they dismounted and approached with the careful wariness of men who had learned not to underestimate a cornered animal. Sarah wanted to throw herself between them, to fight and claw and rage against the injustice of it all, but the cowboy's eyes held hers, with a look that begged her not to make his sacrifice meaningless by getting herself killed in a futile gesture of defiance.